the Love Witch. I'm your ultimate fantasy. Good evening and welcome back to Venom's Vault, the podcast where I talk about drag, horror, and my other niche interests. I'm your hostess, Venom, the vampire MILF of South Texas, and today's episode we are going to be opening up our spell books to talk about witches, witchcraft, and bitches. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into The Craft, which I covered a little bit on last week's episode, as well as Carrie, 1976, and the Annabelle classic, 2016's The Love Witch, starring my favorite, Samantha Robinson. So if you already couldn't tell by my look, this look is loosely inspired by Samantha Robinson's character Elaine Parks in 2016's The Love Witch. I really love that film so much because it's a critique on femininity and power at the same time, because women are expected to be submissive yet powerful, and that is definitely what Elaine embodies within The Love Witch. I chose to go for her signature red coat, the blue eyeshadow, this very 1960s hair, although it could very much be mistaken for a Victorian Gothic look, if you will. But I really did try, so I hope that you enjoy this look if you're watching over here on YouTube. And if you're streaming, just imagine me looking so sickening and fierce, because I do. So just to get a little bit into it, The Craft 1996, I did touch on Nancy Downs from The Craft last week's episode because it is one of the films that I grew up watching and it inspired me so deeply. So I want to talk a little bit about the other three characters. We have Sarah, Rachel, and Bonnie. Oh my god, it's not Rachel. It's Rochelle. I keep confusing it for her actress, Rachel True. So bear with me. If I say Rachel, I mean Rochelle. So Sarah is the new girl in town, and she is the only natural witch of the coven, and she doesn't have a mom. Her mom unfortunately passed away during childbirth, which we find out in the film because of Nancy's insults. But Sarah really is such a interesting character to dissect, especially fashion-wise, because she comes into this new school looking like a sore thumb, really, at St. Benedict's Academy. It's a Catholic school. And I really do resonate with the outsider feeling, you know, growing up queer in South Texas. I didn't really feel like I belonged very much. I had a very charismatic personality, yet I always felt like an outcast, which is not nice, but that is my life. And we have Rochelle, who is one of the only black girls in an all-white school, and she definitely gets racist comments and remarks and gets bullied for that factor. And I think it would have been really cool to not only explore the concept of racism, but also the eating disorder that Rochelle's character was originally supposed to have. And then, of course, we have Bonnie, which is the covered up social outcast because of physical purposes. Bonnie was in a fire and she has scars all over her body and burn marks. So throughout most of the film, she's covered up. But whenever, of course, the coven gets their powers and their witchcraft starts working, Bonnie comes out of her shell and she's able to be this gorgeous and beautiful young girl. And I mean, she's played by the incomparable Neve Campbell. I think she's gorgeous as she is. But of course, Neve Campbell just plays this girl so well, so covered up, so sheltered, but really shows a transformation after her burns are taken away from her. Overall, I think The Craft is a film about sisterhood and honestly, people taking advantage of each other, because whenever the group gets their powers, I really did feel like each of them was leeching off of each other, although it was obvious that Nancy was the antagonist and Sarah was the protagonist, with Rochelle and Bonnie being kind of Nancy's guinea pigs and easily swayed to go with Sarah and or Nancy whenever it sees fit for the plot. However, I do see this overarching theme of sisterhood and belonging when you're an outcast and you're like a new girl in school. As I said last episode, I really do describe The Craft being a Mean Girl sort of film, just with witchcraft and in a Catholic school where girls dress goth. So I really do love The Craft, and I will stop talking your ear off about it because our next film that I'm going to be diving into is Carrie, 1976. So, Carrie 1976 is a film about religious trauma through the lens of the unfortunate Carrietta White, who is bullied relentlessly. She has such a strong religious upbringing, no father, and a very overbearing relationship by her mother. I just really sympathize so much with the character of Carrie because she's the quintessential outcast. She's not like any of the girls in the craft who have their own kind of outcast coven. She is completely lone wolf. And even whenever people try to be nice to her, like Sue telling Tommy to take her to the prom, which is her boyfriend, by the way, I just really felt bad for her the entire time. And so whenever Carrie unleashes all of her power at the prom and causes this entire destruction, you want to root for her. You know, I saw this meme on Instagram ages ago that says, I support women's rights, but I most definitely support women's wrongs as well. And even though it is obvious that murder is wrong, you kind of have this feeling of, well, everybody deserved it after treating Carrie like shit for no reason. I just really do love the film because it's, like I said, a film about repression and release. And that is what Carrie embodies, especially because you poke the bear for so long. Her mother is just constantly abusing her. And it's such a weird dynamic because you know that she loves her. And that might be a controversial statement, but it is a weird, fucked up kind of love that Carrie's mom, Margaret White, puts into her daughter. She thinks that everything is a sin and she thinks that Carrie's doing something wrong whenever all she's doing is coming to terms with her puberty and becoming a woman. And that's something that I love being explored through horror because it is something that society sees as a horror all in its own. And finally, we have 2016's The Love Witch, starring Samantha Robinson, directed by Anna Biller. This is a Technicolor fever dream. I love the 1960s aesthetic. And whenever I was first watching The Love Witch, I thought that there was a mistake, some kind of typo on the date, because there was no way that that film was released in 2016. But it wasn't until you look at the finer details in the background that there are things of modern technology and modern cars in it. But I was really fooled by the aesthetic and just the overall appeal of the film itself, with Samantha Robinson having this really theatrical and campy acting, which I personally love. Whenever I'm in drag and whenever I am posing as Venom, I like to have this very theatrical way of articulating myself and kind of, it's a 1960s way of acting. I really love the 1960s because of its campy side, of its theatrical acting, and it's just so over the top. It is not something that we would see today in theaters. However, it is something that I really do cherish and love about that era. We have the wide eyes and drawn out enunciation. Hello, Wayne. And that's what I love. It's so silly and campy, but it's also extremely effective. And especially in this film, whenever we see Elaine Parks, let me explain what the film is about before I get too far into it. But Elaine Parks is a woman who just wants to be loved, and she dabbles in the love magic, and it backfires, essentially. Men love her so much that they spew out all of their emotions for her, and then they die. And it's so funny because the tagline on the poster literally is, "She loved men to death." And I think that that's extremely campy, but also just a great summarization of what the film represents, because Elaine really does love men to death. So The Love Witch is a complete 180 from what Carrie is, but it has some of the same subtext to it, you know, like Carrie being a complete social outcast is not present within Elaine's character because she seems extremely self-assured and confident and doing whatever she's going to do. But in the same way that Carrie has that insecurity and that burgeoning sexuality, it is something that is definitely present within Elaine, and it is ultimately one of the biggest reasons that she turns to love magic, because she wants a man so badly. And I talked about this in my last episode with Jennifer's Body, about how Jennifer, being this ferocious man-eating succubus diva, was a commentary on how females constantly need male validation, and that was spun in a way where Jennifer would literally feast on the men that she once needed validation from. But you can look at that metaphor in the same ways, where she's literally consuming males to be validated and to keep herself youthful and young, which is why she feasts on boys ultimately, is because she needs to preserve her young appearance, if you will. And so The Love Witch is definitely a almost time capsule sort of film. I love that it is so on the nose 1960s, but it definitely has some modern filmmaking elements, and there are these dreamlike sequences. One of my favorites is whenever Elaine takes home Wayne, which is a libertarian teacher, I believe. He's a professor of some sort, and he has like a gray bob, which is so silly. And she takes him home and she has him drink some kind of hallucinogenic beverage, I believe. And she starts doing this like entire burlesque show for him. And she's wearing like this black 1960s style swing dress, and it opens and there's like a rainbow lining on the inside. And I think that that's so gorgeous. That was an amazing costume design element to add in there for extra flair. And in addition to this, we're seeing this kind of holographic lens effect on it. So whenever we're hitting all the rainbows, we see sparkles and iridescence, which I thought was an amazing touch to the film. I really love how Elaine also sort of portrayed it. Wayne asks her, "Who do you give the rainbow to?" And then Elaine says, "I give the rainbow to you, Wayne." And she just like does her whole strip show, and then they end up having sex. And once he is hooked with her love magic, Wayne starts to literally physically wail like a child, saying, "Elaine, Elaine, I need you, Elaine." And then Elaine's smoking a cigarette on the couch, probably one of the most famous frames of the film, and she's like, "What a pussy." Like, it is just so funny because it definitely flips the scripts on how females are supposed to inherently be these emotional beings who cannot live without a strong man by their side, and that is far from the truth. However, there is a caveat to Elaine's love magic, because her final lover of the film, I forget his name, but he is a police officer or police chief of sorts. And the actor, I believe his name is Gian Keys. I do not know if I'm pronouncing that right, but hopefully I am. And he's very skeptical about witchcraft. And so he does go to visit Elaine within the investigation of Wayne's death. And she basically is like, "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just a witch." And there's a really famous quote where he asks, "Are you a witch?" And she goes, "I am. Is there a law against that?" I mean, obviously there isn't, because it is considered a spiritual practice. However, the delivery of that line also is just so striking, because this is what I'm talking about when I say that 1960s films have this very theatrical yet effective way of delivering their lines. I really love the punctualness of it, and it also reminds me of Shakespearean actors, how they really have to punctuate and enunciate all of their words to give the full effect of what Shakespeare is trying to convey in his works. And if it's not obvious, I am taking a Shakespeare class right now, so I've been working on my close reading skills, if you will. And I really do love talking about femininity in horror, because last semester I did a project in one of my favorite classes I've ever taken in college, where I talk a little bit about images of women in horror and how they have shifted from being disposable objects of society to empowered figures, albeit through the lens of fiction and in horror, which is why I love films like The Love Witch, like The Craft, like Carrie, who show females in a empowered figure position, because it is not something that we often see in society. There are so many gender roles, stereotypes, and beauty standards that are so difficult to abide by, and I really don't believe that we should, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. So if you'll just pivot your attention for a split second to the two beauties behind me, on my right, which is your left, which is my right. On the right, we have Toxin, which is this really trad goth inspired blue haired diva. I gave her some thin eyebrows, and then of course like some really intense blue eyes. I did drop her, unfortunately, and she did get some facial cracks, but I made sure to just fill those in and make them look intentional. And then on my right, which is your left, which is my right, which is on the left, we have Poison, which is my signature drag mug. We have the spiky crease detail with these really thick, dramatic black eyebrows. And then she's actually wearing the hair that I wore last week on the podcast. I really do enjoy this hairstyle and this hair color specifically. Venom's signature colors are like black and red, and I love to incorporate them in almost every look that I do. I do try to be diverse sometimes, however, whenever I wear other colors like purple or blue and what have you. But this is like a signature stamp, quintessential Venom look, if you will. So I'm really happy to have Poison wearing her behind me. Well, my darlings, that is all the time we have for this week's episode of Venom's Vault. But before we close our spell book for the week, I just want to say thank you all for listening to this podcast. It is something I've been wanting to do for a while, and I'm so happy that I'm finally pressing record and making it happen. If you're watching on YouTube, I hope you're enjoying the setup and my looks that I'm bringing every week. I know that this is only the second episode, but I promise you that I have so much more in store and so much more to talk about. Speaking of, next week's episode of Venom's Vault, we will be having a horror movie smackdown, which is basically my nice way of saying that I'm going to be comparing two horror films of a similar genre, of a similar subgenre, or of a similar premise, and I'm going to be ultimately deciding which one I prefer more. I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode of Venom's Vault, where I tackled the concept of witches, witchcraft, and bitches through my favorite horror films with witches in them, including The Craft 1996, Carrie 1976, and Anna Biller's 2016 classic, The Love Witch, starring Samantha Robinson. Thank you so much for watching, streaming, wherever you get your podcast, and I hope to see you next time in the vault. Bye.